You can go to grad school for free and get paid to do it. And that is exactly what I am going to share today with you. And this episode is my journey as a first generation Latina, raised by immigrants, first person in my lineage to attend a master's program, how I was able to graduate with my master's 100% debt free and actually get paid to do my master's. By the end of this episode, you will understand how I found funding through graduate employment positions, how to stand out during the application process when you are applying to the various types of positions that your school or program may offer to get you funding. And you'll also, most importantly, in my opinion, understand how to create funding opportunities for yourself, even when they don't explicitly exist yet, or maybe they're not being advertised. Bienvenidos. Welcome to the Careers Without Connections podcast, the podcast for first generation professionals building their careers from scratch and navigating unfamiliar professional spaces. I'm your host, Gianna Linares. As I kind of just word vomited at you, I am a first generation Latina. And I think an important consideration with that as well is, in addition to not just being a historically underserved population, Latinos have the lowest educational attainment rates in the United States. Especially when it comes to graduate degrees, when I graduated, it was about 7% of Latinos in the US get their master's, and now it's about 8. And I say all of that to say is that if I, from a background of being the very first in my family, not coming from any sort of financial privileges, and having that statistically, like, the least likely to be able to even obtain a degree, but I was able to get it debt free and get paid to do it, I think just speaks to, I would say, unspoken rules of what you can do and how you can navigate grad school and funding and getting it paid for. So when I started grad school, I fully also thought I was going to waitress the entire time. Before I started grad school, I had never had any sort of quote unquote white collar type jobs or experiences. A lot of people in undergrad were doing internships, but I literally could not afford to do an internship because I made more money waitressing. And even then with waitressing, I was still living paycheck to paycheck. And again, I was really trying to avoid taking out any sort of large amounts of debt at all. But that's a conversation for another day. Hint, hint, stay tuned for a future podcast episode. So when I first started grad school, I really had no idea how I was going to pay for it. I think I had been wise in doing my due diligence of doing my research and seeing what type of funding does my program offer before I even applied, because I have noticed a recurring theme of when people comment on my Instagram and TikTok when I post about how I was able to graduate debt free. I have a whole series on that on my TikTok and Instagram, by the way. When people comment and they're like, my program doesn't have any money, they don't offer any types of graduate assistantship positions like the ones that you're mentioning, and they're only partial funding. Well, my university, when I looked into it, I knew that my program specifically had the option to get these positions, and it would entail a full tuition waiver and a stipend. And honestly, I did not even realize how challenging it was going to be to get one of these when I first started. I ended up applying for a couple of them, and I worked through our professional development and career advisor. She was a person who her specific job in our program was to support us in terms of like career and professional development. And I, before I ever even met her face to face, emailed her and was like, hey, I got accepted into this program. I'm incoming. I intend to apply for these, what my school called graduate employment positions. And before I want to move forward talking about anything else, I think it's important to explain also that these types of positions go under several different names. It could be assistantship, research assistantship, graduate assistantship. Sometimes they're called fellows and fellowships too. So yeah, I had reached out to her and been like, hey, I really, really want one of these positions. I think I would be an excellent fit for them. Can you give me some feedback on my application materials? Because keep in mind, I only had barista, waitress, receptionist at a salon type jobs on my resume. And these jobs were mainly like teaching assistant, grading, supporting professors with like research and teaching classes, things that I had absolutely zero experience in. And of course, these positions are competitive, they're limited, and oftentimes they automatically set aside a handful of them for the PhD students because PhD students typically don't pay for their school. After going back and forth with Julie, by the way, my very first ever podcast episode was with Julie, and it's all about the differences between school experiences of first gen students and non first gen. If you want to check it out, we were going back and forth, and she was like, you have really strong materials now. Good luck. And I applied for three or four, and I didn't get a single one. And so then I was like, I'm going to stay at my waitressing job and, that'll get me through school for the next 2 years. I really don't want to do this. Like, this doesn't sound appealing to me whatsoever, but what option do I really have? A few weeks before my graduate program was going to start, a couple of the positions reopened. And there was one specific one that, fortunately for me, I had taken the class the year before and I had actually spoken to the professor a lot during her office hours because she was just very approachable and she was just a great mentor, like student oriented professor, as they should be. And so I went back to the career development advisor, Julie, and I said, "Hey, the position's reopened. What can I do better this time? Like, can we like work through this and talk through it?" And she told me, like, "Yeah, of course, try this with your resume and your application materials, but also have you reached out and spoken to the professor? Have you asked her, like, hey, is there anything important that I should know about the position?" And at the time, I found this out later, but at least the way that it worked in my program, the professors had quite the influence over who was going to get hired. Essentially, yes, your experience did matter, but if they said, I want to work with this student, then the likelihood of them turning you down was little to nothing. So I took Julie's advice and I reached back out to the person that would have been my supervisor for the job, who had taught the class the year before with me. And I said, "Hey, I'm really interested. Is there anything important I should know about this position?" And she was like, "Oh, no, but thank you for reaching out." A few days later, I get an email saying, "Oh, thank you for applying." Like, no interview, nothing. Just thank you for applying. Like, we want to offer you this position. And I was so excited. Like, I remember I was like, so g happy and giddy about getting to leave my serving job because I worked in customer service and, like, service industry throughout school because it was the most time efficient way to make money and, like, be able to balance being a student, but I'm not someone who's meant to be in those roles, like, that's just not me. Like, if I have an issue with you, if you're being disrespectful, I don't wanna tolerate it, and so that can, of course, be really challenging when you work in those types of spaces. Getting that first graduate employment position opened a lot of doors for me afterward because it gave me the leverage that I needed to be able to apply for more. And so at the time, the first one that I got was just for a term. So I went to my restaurant general manager. I said, "Hey, is it okay if I come back in the winter?" And she was like, "Yeah, of course," because she really liked me and it didn't really matter to her. So I am finishing up my first graduate employment position. It's about a term long. I'm like glad that I've gotten a whole term of school covered, but I'm a little disheartened that I have to go back to my serving job. Like serving in the wintertime in Oregon is just depressing. Like business is slow, you're not really making a lot of money. I get an email a few weeks before the term is going to end from a professor that I had actually reached out to before the school year started asking about opportunities with his department, which was a separate department from mine. It was the geography department. Apparently, a lot of their graduate students that had come in with funding from other sources. They had a big need for students and they thought our programs were close enough to each other. And I had emailed him at the start of the school year and he had said, sorry, like, we don't have anything, but thanks for reaching out. Fast forward a few months later, he reaches out and he's like, hey, do you need a graduate employment position for next term? And I was like, absolutely. And he was like, okay, congratulations. The position is yours. And I was very intimidated by the position because it was in a department that I had absolutely zero knowledge of, and I was going to be teaching a discussion course. I had never taught in my life. I didn't know anything about geography. I hadn't taken a geography class since high school, I think sophomore year of high school. And so essentially, I would go to the classes when they would happen, and I would learn and I would take notes along with the students and do the readings along with the students, and even do external research of my own outside of class to learn and to be able to create curriculum materials for the kids and make sure that these students who were paying a lot of money and being referred to us by the professor as like the graduate students who like know everything and can help you. That professor was definitely very skeptical of me and my colleague when we started because we worked from outside of the program and he was getting ready to retire. He'd just been in the field for a while, but he grew a liking to us and he even ended up recommending me for another position in the geography department later on. So at this point, I have two positions funded, two terms out of six of my 2 years of grad school. And a position opened up that was a whole year long. It was 1 year long contract. And these were kind of known as the golden GEs, GEs standing for graduate employment. They were very hard to get and they were very competitive because who doesn't want a whole entire year of their master's program completely paid for, right? And there was a position that had opened up called the Multicultural Services GE. And the whole purpose around that position was to support the retention and professional development of graduate students. And I remember being so intimidated by the job description of this position. But I was like, I feel like this position was literally made for me and I have to give it my all to get it. It's worth it to me to bend over backwards in every single possible way that I could think of. So I did tons of practice interviews with my friends, my mom, my like school classmates, the people in my cohort, our career services director person, Julie. I practiced out loud by myself because fortunately they sent us the questions in advance. So I just practiced my answers over and over and over again. And I actually cried twice on two separate occasions when I was practicing because I just had such little experience with those types of interviews and those types of like questions being asked that at the time about like 3-ish years ago, for me now, I felt like a deer in the headlights. Like, how do I answer this question? I remember the person who currently held my position, I reached out to him to do an informational interview and try and get more information on it so I could be aware and informed, like kind of get like the intel of what the job was so that I could weave that into my interview. And he wasn't responding to my emails, but I knew who he was. So one day I saw him on campus and I like called out his name and I like chased him down basically. But I was just like, hey, 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 talk to me. Tell me what I need to know in a very, very polite way, of course. But he did end up following back up with me in an email. And I feel like that did help me kind of get the intel and the information that I needed to stand out a little bit more in the interview process. And then another thing that, again, Julie, my career services director, advisor, mentor person, had told me was, oh, why don't you go find the interview space before you go so that you're not nervous the day of and like worried about where is it? I don't want to be late. And so I went and I kind of was walking around and I remember this guy coming up to me being like, "Are you okay? Like, are you lost?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, I have an interview here next week or whatever, and I just want to make sure I know where the place is." And he was like, "Oh, okay. That interview was with me. When you get here, just talk to the reception. and they will help you. At the time, in my mind, I was like, this is such a high stakes job because 1 year of my program was around $20,000. I was like, I need to do everything in my power that I possibly can to stand out and do my best. And lo and behold, I was offered the position. Then at that point, meaning I have 5 out of 6 of my graduate terms completely funded. And I'm exhausted at this point because I'm into spring term of my first year of grad school. I've been applying, reaching out, cold emailing all these different people, following up, applying in different departments. And I'm just tired, right? Because I think every student is tired by the end of spring term because you've kind of been going nonstop since January. You don't really have as much breaks in between. And a position opens up in my program kind of out of the blue, and it's a very specific position. It's related to Latinx research, urbanism and migration. And I look at who the position is with, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I've talked to this guy before. I had reached out to him a few months back and just said, hey, is there any opportunity to work with you and do research with you? Because in grad school, I really wanted research experience, and that was a little bit more money in my pocket as well too. He was leaving the school and he had this really big grant that he had acquired when he was teaching there that he needed to he wanted to use the rest of the money before he left because he couldn't take it with him to the new university. So I almost didn't apply because I was like, there's no life force in me to muster up the energy to apply and go through this interview process. And I think at the time too, I was kind of thinking like, oh, I already talked to him and he didn't seem that interested. But I essentially forced myself to apply. And I remember telling my professor, one of my mentors, I don't think my interview went well. But, I did my best and I'm still really happy that I've gotten 5 out of 6 of my terms covered for school. I believe the next day after the interview, I get an email when I'm at the gym with my friend saying, congratulations, I want to offer you the position. And I was like jumping up and down at the gym. And that experience ended up being so wonderful for me and such a blessing in a lot of different ways. Mainly being that that was the first time I ever had a professor in academia or like a mentor who had the same background as mine. He was also first generation Latino, raised by immigrants. And having someone that understands the types of challenges, both internal and external, that you're going through when you are in the position of being the first in your family to navigate that space, and also just not really being in an institution that was created for people like you from your background. And especially at the time being at University of Oregon, where Oregon and its population is obviously very monochromatic, to put it very simply. It's just the demographic is largely white everywhere. That was such a pivotal experience for me as a grad student. And when we wrapped up, speaking of creating further opportunities for yourself too, that GE that was supposed to just be the spring term ended up extending into a summer type internship that was able to get me a little bit more money in my pocket and help me really build my resume more. Because doing a job, since we were on a term system for 10, 11, 12 weeks, like that was such little time to really be able to put on my resume and say, like, I did these things and I had these like tangible, measurable outcomes of success, right? And so it ended up benefiting me in a number of ways that I never even fathomed and thought of. Again, what a blessing. At the end of our contract, when it was the end of the summer, he was leaving the university, I was like, I'm really surprised that you hired me. I didn't think I interviewed very well. First of all, he told me, I thought you did great in your interview, but what I remember, like, I was kind of taken aback a little bit by, and even to this day, he was like, I remembered you when you reached out to me all those months ago, and that you showed the initiative to ask, even though you really weren't sure about whether there was a concrete opportunity, because again, nothing was being advertised. I had just heard and been advised by Julie, hey, there's this professor who has a very sizable grant. He might have an opportunity for you. Why don't you ask? So I think just kind of tying it back into a lot of the actionable steps that I took to get funding for my master's, which was just asking and reaching out and introducing myself. And a lot of the times it was not right now, but they remembered me later, and either they reached out, or when I followed back up, I immediately stood out and was put at the top of their thoughts of, "Oh, okay, this is someone who's serious about this opportunity." And you're probably asking yourself, like, you might be asking yourself, why does any of this matter, Gianna? Like, what does this have to do with graduating without debt? I just want to highlight that I didn't just pursue opportunities, like, I took them. And when they didn't exist, I essentially created them. All of this happened because I put myself out there and I asked about opportunities. And when I was told no, I accepted no with grace, and I made sure to leave a foot in the door and like keep the door cracked. I feel like everyone else in my program that was either getting 0 GEs, or maybe they landed 1 in their whole 2 years. I remember there was this one girl, she was telling me she'd applied for, like, 17 or something, and she hadn't gotten a single one, but they were all doing the same thing. They were just applying blindly. They were applying for programs outside of ours with people that they didn't know and had no prior connection with. One thing I've learned, especially when it comes to, like, career and professional development, is that just because everyone else is doing something doesn't mean you should be doing it too. In fact, I even feel like if everyone else is doing something, you should strive to see how you can be different and stand out. Because at the end of the day, everyone is blending in together into this mass. I also want to point out that your efforts of like all the outreach at the initial start, it feels like you're getting nowhere, but it's all like compounding interest. Like it's just moving you forward ultimately to the goal that you have in mind, which in this case is finding funding for your degree. Because another thing that I didn't even mention that is making me think of right now, just reflecting on everything I just talked about to you, is that sometimes you can get referred. Like someone may say, hey, I don't have anything, but I heard this person has an opportunity. Or, I had gone to Julie and said, I really want to find more funding and I just don't see anything being advertised that matches my experience or something that I'm interested in or really have a viable opportunity in. And she was like, oh, I heard about this professor that is doing the type of research that you're interested in. And, why don't you go ask? And look how wonderfully that ended up turning out. Even going all the way back to my initial conversation when I was still an undergrad and I had gone out of my way to go to office hours and talk to the professor of the class and just express to her like my interest and my eagerness to get a graduate degree and do research and all those things. She remembered me even months later. And visibility really is currency. And there's so much power, I think, in showing initiative. And there's a lot of, I think, this idea around showing initiative as, oh, well, like I'm going to come off like desperate or pushy, or no. Like, I feel like as long as you show up like professionally and politely, and also I strongly believe genuinely, like the person, if it's meant to happen, like they're going to respect you. And if anything, More often than not, I don't feel like me reaching out and showing initiative has ever gotten me anything other than more respect. Now that you made it to the end of the episode, first of all, thank you so much for listening and watching. But to kind of recap what we just talked about, you now have the knowledge of how to find funding for graduate school, how to stand out during the hiring process, how consistently putting yourself out there and asking for opportunities can completely change your graduate school experience and overall funding opportunities, of course. If you resonated with this episode and if you want to hear more, of course, please like, subscribe, and leave a review, of course, so that other people can also find the podcast, so that other first gens can find the podcast and we can all, talk. If you want to get in touch with me, I always respond to LinkedIn messages, but my TikTok and my Instagram is at Gianna Linares, and I post a lot of short form content that isn't on the podcast, specifically related to building career opportunities for yourself and navigating unfamiliar spaces on those platforms as well. So check me out there, and I will leave this information in the show notes as well. And of course, stay tuned for weekly episodes every Sunday.